Coming up, Joe Schoen's press conference gives breadcrumb trails throughout the draft, including the potential of what could happen at the top with the sixth overall pick, an update around Darius Slayton, around Darren Waller, and whether or not we think that there could be more trade down possibilities than trading up. We dive in on it all coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we are brought to you today by Pietential. Pietential. That's pietential.com. It's an online assessment tool, basically a check-in on your well-being. It's 100% free for individual users. You can set benchmarks, have tools to improve, and also track your progress over time. It's fantastic whether you're dealing with some high-intensity situations like the NFL draft, like the NFL Combine, or maybe just day-to-day. You get over to pietential.com today and start taking advantage of getting your best well-being aligned. Pietential. That's pietential.com. Andy, Joe Schoen maybe needs a little Pietential just to make sure that he's on the right page coming out of that press conference. How do we feel? High level. How do we feel about Joe Schoen at the presser?
I do really like Joe Schoen when he's speaking because he doesn't really say anything of consequence. He uses words like expectation, and he really just makes sure like he's not going to get caught out in something that'll be used against him later. And I don't want my general manager coming out giving the game plan or the script of what we're actually going to be doing. So I kind of like, the way that Joe Schoen approaches it.
I like, if you're watching on YouTube, I like that when he answers questions, he'll say, well, hey, look, and he'll put his hands out on the, he'll use he's not a prop guy. If he had more water bottles, I think, or if he had little chess pieces, he'd say, well, if I was over here, then I do a little bit of this. Let me tell you the deal here, Bob. I find his press conference fascinating because he seems genuine. He seems that he's being thoughtful in responses, and then to your point, it doesn't necessarily seem like when they're over, you have any real stronger sentiment around big picture stuff. There's a lot to take away from this, I think, from Joe Schoen. And we're going to get into obviously talking about Darius Slayton because that was the breaking news that came out kind of a day before here. We debated coming on, Andy, and doing a special live update around him, but it folds into the draft conversation as well. So we'll get into that. We'll get into Darren Waller. But the biggest thing at the high level, I think, for me is when when asked about the QB room and expectations going into the draft. Unlike earlier in the offseason, pre-Drew Lock signing and the combine, there's a lot of conversations that happened here. It was, do you feel like you need to add a quarterback in the upcoming draft? Joe Schoen said, yeah, of course. At some point, we're going to need to. At some point in the draft, we're going to need to add a quarterback. He then, since then, at yesterday's press conference said, no, we feel comfortable with Daniel Jones, with Drew Lock, with Tommy DeVito, and we don't feel an impetus to maybe do anything in the draft. How do you take that? Is it because you signed Drew Lock that you feel fine with it? Or do I take the tinfoil hat off of your head and put it on my own and say, well, obviously, because the speculation's been about them wanting to maybe trade up to get a QB at the top, he's going to say everything that denies the idea that they want a QB.
Yeah. So I have been very consistent about the messaging that Joe Schoen is putting out there and why things are happening. There's one key important piece to all of this that I hope will resonate with everyone. What is coming out of Joe Schoen's mouth when he speaks versus what are the reports, inside sources, beat writers, tea leaves, everyone else speculating that they think is going to happen? Because the day after the Giants finished the season, Joe Schoen acknowledged that they only had two quarterbacks under contract. They are going to have to address the quarterback situation in the offseason. A lot of people ran with that and were like, number 6 pick, Giants are enamored with JJ McCarthy. All that's good, great, and grand. Then at the combine, they talked about what about the quarterback room? And they said they still need to add a quarterback on the roster. That was pre-free agency and leading up to the draft. And Joe Schoen reiterated, he said, it can be through free agency, and it doesn't preclude us from doing it in the draft as well. So Joe Schoen basically was like, we know we have to do it. It either has to be in free agency or has to be in the draft. He doesn't pivot himself or put himself into a corner, either negotiating with free agents or showing his cards to everyone saying it absolutely has to be in the draft by hook or by crook. Joe Schoen always gives himself an out and gives him flexibility. I think it's all of the in between when we don't hear Joe Schoen speak that you're like, oh, Rich Eisen came out and said they have buyer's remorse on Daniel Jones, or oh, they love JJ McCarthy and they're trading up to 4. You've never heard any of this from Joe Schoen himself. He has been steadfast and consistent with what is coming out of his mouth. It's just the reports surrounding the Giants and what they are going to do are the things that keep changing based on where the wind is blowing.
Sure. I mean, yeah, speculation is the nature of the offseason, nature of pre-draft stuff as well. He was asked about the Rich Eisen report too, but the only thing I'll mention on this, because then I want to get into the more interesting aspects of what else he had to say here, is okay. First of all, he's not going to come out and tell you that he has buyer's remorse about Daniel Jones' contract, right?
Of course not.
So,
Of course.
I know you're not. Yeah, and you're not suggesting that he would. And I think that's what I think, because I believe everyone deserves a good amount of grace here in the off season when all these rumors are flying and you want to grab onto different ones and run with them to whatever extent. Like, we've taken narratives and tried to build them out and see where they land us. And at times, it's an exercise just for us to get to a point where we're like, yeah, and that's why I'd still take Roma Dunes 8-6, right? Like, where we keep coming back to, which has been our planted flag in the ground since basically the first impetus of what's it going to look like at the combine? Who are we watching for? Who do we like at the top? It's been Roma Dunze. But I understand, like, Rich Eisen doesn't come out and say, like, the Giants had buyer's remorse because he thinks it's interesting to say. Like, somebody somewhere said that, and it has a seedling somewhere. And while Joe Schoen isn't going to come out and say that directly, I think that the old, if he had truth serum in his veins, what would he tell you? He would tell you, we got a little bit out over our skis following winning a playoff game against Minnesota. I, the GM of the New York Football Giants, got a little overexcited, started to make some moves that suggested we thought we could compete now and win now. And it little bit of a road bump here. Maybe overcommitted some dollars where I shouldn't have, and maybe mismanaged some opportunities. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think it dramatically throws off their timeline, but I think perceptually it starts to signal all of these things, and we start grabbing onto it. And I kept coming back to a year ago when we said, what's the win total range for this team, right? Even after that win in the playoffs, I still said I thought their floor was 6 and their ceiling was 9, right? So it was like, hey, they're still that type of team. So it's something to keep in mind here as we move along. We'll continue these conversations next week, but we know we got the draft coming up. Other things that happened here then, when we talk about being at the top, one of the other really interesting things is Joe Schoen came out and said, yeah, surprised about how many calls we've been getting about 6. A lot of teams interested in trading up. My curiosity here is, if we believe that some of this stuff is just fodder around the QBs, do you think that the calls he's getting are about coming up for presumably JJ McCarthy? He's the only quarterback that seems to have viable traction in the top 10, unless you think, Penix Jr. is a sneaky candidate. It doesn't seem like it right now. Do you think the calls are about getting a QB? Or is the excitement and buzz around a Joe Alt, or maybe even saying, oh, Malik Neighbors ended up being there at 6, and we're a team that really likes that model of weapon, and we want to come get him? That's what I think is fascinating. What are the calls coming up about at the 6th spot?
Yeah, that is a good point. I will answer your question, then I will turn it over to another question that I have. I
A
think
good
I
question
think
for a
it's
question.
squarely
Okay.
around Joel. I really do think that there are going to be teams that look at it and say, well, if the 4 quarterbacks go when they think they're going to go within the first 5 picks ish, maybe.
Yeah.
You look at the Chargers. People have speculated they could take Joel. They could take Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors, depending on who they like in that spot. Then you kind of sit there and you still have one of the top 3 wide receivers. You have the best offensive tackle. He's been the number 1 rated offensive tackle since before the season started. He has done nothing to change it. If you were a team that is like, we have to protect our quarterback at all costs, moving up to get Joe Alt doesn't seem like a bad situation. Knowing that the Tennessee Titans are sitting right behind the Giants, they have been speculated as someone that is going to take Joe Alt if he is there. If you want the
Mhm.
best offensive tackle in the draft, the 6th spot is a really interesting point to do it. The other thing you
Yeah.
mentioned is, if one of the quarterbacks falls, everyone is speculating that the Giants would be there to be able to pounce on someone like JJ McCarthy. But if they're not in love with JJ McCarthy, or if Joe Schoen is true in his idea that we're going to give Daniel Jones another crack at this and we'll figure everything else out later, then the trade back is a possibility. And Adam, my question to you is, do you think Joe Schoen brought this up and put an emphasis on how many calls he's getting at 6 to kind of brace everyone for the fact that he may trade out of the pick when JJ McCarthy or Drake May or Malik Neighbors might be there, and everyone is like, you got to draft this franchise guy?
That's a juicy question, Andy. Let's answer that in just one moment. Best tease in the business as we let you know that this answer is going to be brought to you by Personam. Personam is an online cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. Answer your question, Andy? Yes. I think that he is paving the way to say that there is value here. So let's go back and use that example we talk about. One thing, by the way, whether or not we think it's verbiage or otherwise, I think that if there was a more realistic opportunity for the Giants to get Drake May, because I think that that actually is a prospect that they really love at a high level over JJ McCarthy, I think maybe you'd hear things a little bit differently here at the top of the draft, but I think it's going to be hard to get to that spot, to the third overall pick. But to me, we always said, even if you believed in one of the quarterbacks, you're going to trade to 4, trade to 3. Okay, the 70th overall pick and a second round pick next year, maybe the 47th this year, something has to be involved to get there. All of a sudden you turn around and you don't have a lot of opportunities to continue to improve this roster. Whereas the trade down, as sexy as any of these, believe me, Andy and I want Rome Odunze to be a New York Football Giant. It is in our blood. But if you make a trade down, and I'll paint one of the actually like the darker timelines here, because I executed one of these where you end up trading back with the Raiders. I was gonna say Oakland because, hey, sorry, Oakland. 13, you get a first round pick next year. In doing that, I can make the picture of, right, you can still get yourself now a pivot, maybe to cornerback, tandem player for Deonte Banks. There have been scenarios where Rome Odunze falls as low as 10 to 12, though I think that's very unlikely. But in this version of it, Arnold, gone. Quinion Mitchell, gone. JJ McCarthy, obviously gone. Rome Odunze, gone. And now you're sitting there at 13. You have this first round pick in your pocket, but what does it look like? And this is where I think the question becomes, what is Thomas Jr. in the wide receiver spectrum? Because Joe Schoen mentioned in his press conference, it's a deep wide receiver class, not only from a high-level talent standpoint, but also extra value, special teams and otherwise. That's not why we bring up Thomas Jr. But if I can trade back to the teens, and in this version, the first round pick next year is great. I even love getting a second or a third round this year. It's more opportunities for me to fill out my roster, and it changes what the board looks like in terms of viable players to take. Right now, when we talk about options at 6, I think you and I agree. If a quarterback fell and you loved him, great, or wide receiver. You and I have not talked about Bowers being a viable option. We've sometimes mentioned Joe Alt. It's certainly a possibility, but by and large, we think weapon, wide receiver, one of these elite talents. Once you trade back, everything, it really does. The position opens up in terms of what you think. Cornerback becomes viable. Wide receiver still there. There's some offensive linemen if you thought that you wanted to maybe go that way, and even edge rushers come into play. So I that's what I find fascinating. And if you are a team who has a win total over under of 6.5 coming into this season, that usually tells you that there is more needs to fill on this roster than just getting, while we love him and we want him, an elite wide receiver talent at the top.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think Joe Schoen is just bracing everyone because people have started planting their flags on the specific player that they want the Giants to draft at 6. But if the Giants aren't drafting at 6, they can't get that player anymore, Adam. And people are
That's
going
right.
to be critical of that move. There's speculation that the Denver Broncos, sitting at 12, could be an interesting trade partner for the Giants. There's a couple of different reasons for that. One is they have Patrick Surtain, who is an awesome cornerback, who is going into his 4th year, has the 5th year option available. He will need to be paid in short order, but he's a guy that could be moved for them to move up. There's the idea of the 12th pick in Patrick Surtain. Wow, the Giants could get a lockdown corner to sit opposite Deonte Banks and still be able to go get Brian Thomas Jr. or someone else to address the issues. So there are ways that the Giants could do this. We have mentioned on the show, Cortland Sutton is a decent fallback option if they're going to put a package together and they say, we'll give you pick 12, Cortland Sutton, and a second round pick or a third round pick, all of a sudden the Giants are filling multiple areas of need. And to Joe Schoen's point, he is making sure everyone knows we are not 1 or 2 players away from competing for a Super Bowl championship. So if the Giants can fill multiple areas with that 6th pick and they're not convinced in the quarterback that's going to be there, it feels like a good position for the Giants to trade back. Like we have said it all along. We prefer the trade back more than the trade up, understanding
Yes.
that if they do trade up, they're getting their franchise quarterback of the future.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's like, you drop it into this hat. I'm not going to sit here and say, what are you doing? You traded up. Again, at a certain point, you have to say, well, I assume Joe Schoen did his research, right? They spent a ton of energy on top 30 visits and on bringing every single quarterback, scouting, pro days, and otherwise, which again, coming out of this press conference still remains real. The amount of energy and scouting, scouting resources they dedicated to QBs, it happened. And one of two things, either it means that something still exists there in terms of QB value, or the Giants are so bullish on what the true strategy is that they're willing to throw things off the table here a little bit. And what I will say too on that front, because I want to get into some of the other narratives here that came out of this presser. And by the way, Joe Schoen talked about this too, which I'll get to in a second. Is just that if you're dedicating resources one way, but maybe you're thinking about doing something else, specifically when we think about the way, and you mentioned this time and again, top six picks in the draft. If 3 QBs go and then it goes into wide receivers and there's no trade up for a QB, the Giants still get one of the top 3 wide receivers that are by and large considered to be right there alongside each other. It's a can't lose option. So at that point, you might think that the Giants would allocate their funds a little bit differently, right? Spread out their resources because it's easy to. So you can maybe have the smoke screen because you're so bullish on the wide receivers. Or if you're thinking about wanting to get as much value out of the first round and the trade down is on the table, you spread it around and you try to get as much information about as many guys that could be in and around the 6 to say 13, 14 range. It's just fascinating to me. Joe Schoen did also discuss what it's like if initially he took the question, which I thought was a little bit cute by him, because he takes the question of, they're like, oh, if you're there and there's value and you're in the position of power, what does that look like? He goes, oh yeah, well, if you're a team at the top of the draft here and you see someone's calling in, it's okay. Where do we think the value is? You have leverage there. And he kept referring to it in a way of like the Giants trying to go up. And they were like, no. What if it's you, Joe? You have the leverage. He goes, yeah, well, that's great too. And then you start thinking about, where's our board? Where do we have prospect X and Y? And what would it mean to make that decision? I will just keep reiterating that I think these things are fascinating. He mentioned paralysis by analysis, right? About you like having this thing set. Their board is supposed to be set by today, Friday, so that they don't have to do it anymore. He said, like, I like the idea of getting to the place where the board is set. We have our different scenarios that could play out, but ultimately we know what we have in front of us, and I can stop thinking about it because it's what we do, what the media does, what fans do. And I think fans are the first group to get tired of it. Let's get to the draft, right? Because all we're talking about is all these possibilities. It's what's happening behind closed doors for the Giants and every team in the NFL, but they're tired of it too. They want to have the draft happen and go, great, we drafted, we believe in our process. And he mentioned that as well. If you believe in your process, no matter how things play out, you feel confident that you got a quality player because you did the research and the prep ahead of time.
I mean, think about it. He also mentioned that there were 170 players that were on their board that went back to school. So, like, think about how many.
That was a really fascinating one, right? 170 draftable players that went back to college, and you're like, well, I guess we'll go ahead and file those away. Take those off the table.
So think about how many players they're scouting and how they have to do this, Adam. It's an exhausting process. And when they get to this point, they're like, oh, do we want to move this guy up or down? It's like, but what has actually changed over the last 24 hours? We did the homework 2 months ago. Like, what is changing? At some point, you have to put the pencil down or put the Sharpie down or the dry erase marker down and say, we've done the homework. We feel confident. There's no longer time to tinker on this.
You put the pen or pencil down, the Sharpie, and you go, scared money don't make money. Am I right, Dibs? Hey, baby, come on now. Here we go. Oh, like there's such a spectrum of Joe Schoen and who he is as a personality, how he communicates when he's sitting in front of that microphone, the little behind the scenes stuff. I think the best part about Joe Schoen is that he lets his guard down, like just enough in just enough key moments where you're like, there's a lot more going on here for old Joey S than he maybe wants you to know because he just can't. It seems like he can't help himself. He likes the process. He likes being in this position, and he does seem to have a lot of confidence in what the organization can accomplish. The other things that came out of here were obviously a small question, a quick question about Slayton, but it is one we're going to expand on here in a moment, as well as Darren Waller. These two narratives are now building in a direction again for a team that has a lot of needs. Nothing better than having multiple skill position weapons say, I don't know, maybe I'm here, maybe I'm not. We'll get into that in just one moment. Okay, so as we said at the top or near the top, there was also the news about Darius Slayton, voluntary workouts. No, nobody, doesn't matter. And Joe Schoen was asked this. He said, "Yep, nobody's obligated to be here. It's his prerogative, Darius Slayton, to come or not come, and that's totally fine. Doesn't hold anything against him." When asked about the skill position room, the wide receiver room specifically, and approaching the draft, I listen, maybe I'm going too deep here, but Joe Schoen said, yeah, obviously we have Jalen Hyatt who can take the top off. Now, Darius Slayton, in theory, is a burner that takes the top off of defenses. Said he loves the way Wan'Dale Robinson came on last year and what he showed. And then he did say, Darius Slayton, uber consistent for us over these past handful of seasons. And I don't knock him for it. Delineating the groups as being the two guys that I drafted in the second and third round, and then a holdover that we have from a year prior. I think that's totally fine. Right now, as it stands, Darius Slayton is looking at it and saying, I'd like to have a contract extension. I signed a 2-year deal. You go and look at the numbers. Listen, is he a perfect elite number one? Of course not. But he has been consistent from a yardage standpoint. We know the drops and everything else. I get why he's angling for this. Shane mentioned being good friends with his agent. They're not overly concerned about it, but it doesn't look like Joe Schoen is looking to address that situation either, especially before the draft.
Yeah, the last point that you just made is the point that I take away from this. There is no benefit to Joe Schoen addressing it in any way, shape, or form before the draft, right?
Right.
But why tip your hand to show either an area of need or an area that you don't need someone? And so when I think about this Darius Slayton thing, I think it helps that Darius Slayton said this to Joe Schoen prior to the draft, so they could say, okay, now we understand there's a scenario where maybe we don't need one wide receiver, we need two
Yeah.
wide receivers
Yeah.
because Darius Slayton may be on the go. Maybe there's another team that thinks that he's worth a multi-year deal and is willing to pay him. When you see Jerry Jeudy and other guys get traded and make 14, 15, 17 million dollars, Darius Slayton's like, I'm giving almost 90% of their production. I'm worth more than $6 million on a 1-year deal. I totally understand what Darius Slayton's doing. And Joe Schoen addressing it prior to the draft would be malpractice on his part because it eliminates his options and flexibility. He has to look at it and say, Darius Slayton may not be here. We may need to draft someone else, but at least we know what it is going into the draft so we can make these informed decisions. You would hate it if Slayton came out the day after the draft and did this, and you're like, well, we didn't account that in our draft strategy.
Yeah, the hard thing, unfortunately, because like we said, I like Darius Slayton. I think in a lot of ways, if you talk about Daniel Jones put in a hard spot, no weapons, no line, all these things. A fifth round wide receiver that comes in and like ends up being the de facto number one wideout for a team year over year. Like, hey, you have grossly outperformed your draft position, right? But to your point, like, I don't know what the end game is here. You feel like you're deserving of more, and I appreciate that. But you're doing it at the head of a draft with a very deep wide receiver class. And if it's the idea that, hey, if not here, somewhere else, I'd like to get a payday. The world where the Giants, maybe if they see the writing on the wall and go, well, maybe we get a 4th round pick for you from somebody, right? Well, that team might just say, and now we get good value for 1 year, and then you'll go do whatever you want on the market. Like, good luck, buddy. That's the weird thing to me, is that I get why Slayton brings it up and why he wants it, but it's a hard spot to be in, I think, right now. I think it's the absolute wrong time probably to be saying it, because you let the Giants, as you say, let's watch the draft. Okay, we're in the 4th round. Looks pretty good here. Let's send off Darius for an extra 4th round pick. We'll double up on a couple positions in need. We'll add another wide receiver prospect. We'll fill out our room, or we'll open ourselves up to discussions with other teams and wide receivers that we think we could bring in. It's just, I wonder how that plays out. My suspicion is Slayton is just here, and he's just trying to put it on the table that, like, he wouldn't hate if maybe some negotiations happened as the year unfolded. We've seen Joe Schoen go at the trade deadline week and say, hey, in-house guys, can we get some deals done? I think maybe he's angling for that, especially if he comes out and looks productive. The other one would be, go ahead and you can close out there, but then the other one is obviously just like more breadcrumbs on a guy that I hate to tell you, man, getting pretty fully checked out here on Darren Waller.
Well, so the last thing I'll say with Slayton is keep in mind he didn't show up for voluntary workouts. There are bonuses associated. I think it was a couple $100,000 for Darius Slayton. And I saw Dan Duggan actually posted because someone asked, like, what does it void immediately when you don't show up day one? Like, what happens to that
Right.
bonus? And it's kind of a thing like you need to show up for like 85% of the voluntary workouts. So Darius Slayton, in theory, could miss the next week and a half leading up to the draft and just show up on Monday morning and be like, hey guys, I'm
Right.
here, still collect his bonus and make his point proven that he still wants a contract. So like this is him letting everyone know that he wants a contract, but it's not him putting a firm flag in the ground saying, I will not play under this. And it's not him saying, I'm willing to forego money in order to prove my point. Right now, it's just a sentimental, like, I want more than I have. I would be curious to see if it starts actually impacting Darius Slayton's money at that point, whether he decides to show up for some of these voluntary workouts.
The other thing that got mentioned here by Joe Schoen, you bring it back to when you mentioned 170 draftable players that ended up going back to college. Inside of that response, because it was about what impacts in terms of decisions you make now in this class and then looking forward. And it's the idea that you take into future draft classes, future free agent classes, right? And where you think you're going to be along with developing your own in-house talent. I cannot get away from just this press conference and just this buildup without saying the fact that they had sent a timeline around when Darren Waller, they expected a decision to be made here. All the indications, and I guess you take it for what it's worth, most media are saying about, you'll remind me who it was specifically, 90-10, that Darren Waller is going to retire. At that point, like, I keep coming back to this. I don't know who Darren Waller thinks he is in the spectrum of NFL talent that he is saying, if this is the case, if he's legitimately contemplating retirement for other reasons, so be it. But if the narrative that he is waiting to see what the Giants do at the quarterback position before determining if he wants to play again, if that is the driving force of his decision, he is out of his mind. Like, in what world are you're here to dictate the terms of? And by the way, if you moved up and drafted Drake May, then I'll stick around and play. But if I had to catch balls from Daniel Jones, I can't imagine, or Drew Lock, I can't imagine why I would stay here. The one caveat I will give him is that, and I thought about this, about going back and watching some throws from Jones and even for, and looking at Tyrod Taylor, Tommy DeVito, and saying, were there times when Darren Waller would say, my QB play exposed me more to injury risk? And that's really what I'm talking about here. A level of play where I don't feel like I'm confident going for that ball over the middle, making those big plays. It's the nature of football, so I'll give him that grace around it. But by and large, I've said this before, I'm pretty checked out on Darren Waller.
Okay, so a couple things. One, it was the Giant Insider beat writer for the New York Giants. He said,
Yes.
after talking to people around the building, it sounds 90-10 that Darren Waller is retiring. Okay, understood. To your point, it would be absolutely ridiculous. Adam, what if it's also the other way? This is just a footnote of, like, what if he's like, I want to catch passes from Daniel Jones. If they decide to go with a rookie QB, I don't want to stick around and deal with a rookie QB, right? Like, Darren Waller,
I guess that would make at least make more sense from a veteran experience versus inexperience.
Like,
sure.
I don't want the 20-year-old JJ McCarthy. I don't want to sit around and baby him. Like, when Daniel Jones was healthy and I was healthy at the beginning of the year, I was one of the top 5 tight ends in receiving yards in the league. So, like, it could be actually the other way that people aren't thinking about. I have a little tinfoil hat that I have put on.
Oh, dude, Andy, hey, Andy, do you have any tinfoil hat we could do before we get out of here?
Listen, I want to leave everyone with this and just think about this. What if Darren Waller is doing the Giants a favor, Adam? What if he knows that he is retiring and Joe Schoen said, hey, listen, it doesn't matter either way. Like, you can retire before or after. We would love it if you just gave just give it a couple weeks to think about so that we can go through the draft, so it does not seem like we have a significant area of need at the tight end position. It is no skin off your back, Darren. You're going to get your money either way. It literally doesn't change the dollars that you get, but man, does it help the Giants out. And we talked about it before. If the Giants trade back with the Broncos and they get Patrick Surtain as a result of it, like, or they get Cortland Sutton, it doesn't matter. What if at 12 or 13, the Giants sit there and say, Brock Bowers is the guy. He has fallen to us there. If Darren Waller was there, it would be kind of questionable to take the pick. But if Darren Waller retires in short order and the Giants are able to get Brock Bowers, why wouldn't they just tell him to wait 2 weeks before announcing it?
Okay. And I love it, because nothing makes me happier than debunking your tinfoil hat. Like, I like to do it in real time whenever possible. Then why would he say he was considering retirement at all? Just say, I'm super excited to prepare for the season. If he's doing a solid, he would say, Joe Schoen, I'm heavily contemplating retirement. Actually, you know what? I'm going to retire. And Joe goes, great. Why don't you just not say anything about that until after the draft? And then you can retire and it's all good. But if you say it beforehand.
Darren Waller has his own reputation to uphold. He doesn't want it to be like, I'm doing this and then all of a sudden, whatever. Like, maybe he just wants to put the breadcrumbs out there so that when he does, everyone's bracing for it. Listen, it sounds like he's leaning more towards retirement. It would make sense. The fact that he's not, answering it now, he doesn't have any reason really to. But at some point, at the end of the day, he is also losing out on some bonus money, and he's going to be walking away from like 12 and a half, $10 million basically, if he decides that he doesn't want to play football anymore.
On top of your tinfoil hat, there was a little man wearing his own little tinfoil hat on that one. The other thing that I'll just close out on is as we get towards the draft, we'll have some more prospect. We did one last week on the cornerback. We're going to continue to build those safety, excuse me, Jaden Hicks. And by the way, traction with him, 107 might be too late for him. Might have to think up in the draft or making moves, but I really like him as a player. We'll have more of those just kind of out there for you next week. But you see here on the rundown, if you're watching on YouTube, the final note was a harsh reality, question mark. And that's because maybe to your point at the top, whatever we think, I think that the truth lies somewhere in the middle around, do the Giants have buyer's remorse on paying Daniel Jones? Yeah, probably a bit, because letting him go to the market and have the market tell them what they need to pay him, they could be paying him $25 million right now. And then you'd be having a different conversation, because what a player makes directly connects to the perception of who they are as a player, if they're good or bad, where their value lies, right? They see this on the Nets one with Ben Simmons. When you're paying, by the way, same amount of money, $40 million. You look at him and guess what? Injury history. There's some parallels here. You say, oh, well, he's not, he's a terrible player. Well, when you're making 40 million, then there's an expectation of production. When you're making 20 million, it's different. And I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle here, that the Giants did get overcommitted on Daniel Jones, but it doesn't change the fact that as a player and as a skill set, they do like what Daniel Jones is. And the harsh reality, as I mentioned in this show, 6.5 over under on wins. I think the reality is far closer to let's add pieces, let's add weapons, and somewhat because we're kind of pigeonholed into this spot here, and a little bit because there might be a breadcrumb trail of optimism around him. The Giants, Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll, Mike Kafka, the entire organization is like, hey, there's worse things than soft rolling the dice one more time with Daniel Jones under center. We brought in Drew Lock. We still have a backstop here, but I am very suspicious that the Giants would have like a 3% chance of optimism that Daniel Jones gets somewhere closer back to 2 years ago. And you say, maybe it's not the worst if he's still around here. And I just think that fans should have that in their minds here, because I don't think the automatically done with Daniel Jones after this year, while I believe it will be the outcome, I don't think it's as definitive as we all have made it out to be here, especially when you talk about QB prospects and the Giants moving up and all this other stuff.
At the end of the day, patience is a virtue. And it feels
Oh,
like when you're a general manager, rather than a fan, like you take a little bit of everything, you absorb it, you think before reacting. It's the same thing
that's
with
right.
Darren Waller. It's the same thing in the quarterback room. It's the same thing overall. Joe Schoen is preaching patience. He is taking a step back. He's thinking about the longer term vision. We have said, yeah, we don't think that Daniel Jones will be here past this season. But if he ends up playing well and the Giants make a playoff run, he's already under contract. Like he's going to be the starter next season. Now,
Right.
people may say that that's far fetched and that is not where Daniel Jones's
100%.
play is getting to. But that is the reality of it, is that Joe Schoen gave him this contract. He's preaching patience. And if Daniel Jones exceeds expectations that everyone else has for him, he could potentially be around as the quarterback next year.
You better believe it, guys. Listen, next week is draft week, Thursday night, round number 1. So that's obviously going to be when this whole thing will kick off. And then we can put to rest what happens at the 6th overall pick. Between now and then, some prospect profiles for you guys to digest. We're going to have one second, third, fourth round getting back into the middle rounds here, because that's when a lot of the success or failure of this draft is going to be made. It's easy to take Roma Dunze at 6. The question is, what do you do after that? So we'll have all that next week, some coverage. We'll see where the narratives build up from here and anything else that breaks over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, over on X at One Giant Podcast, at AMAC214, at Adam Armbrecht, and on those podcast feeds. Greatly appreciate everybody spending their Friday with us. We'll see you again next week, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.